particular to allow me to be here today. This is very much a scene-setting panel, so I'm going to focus my remarks on the scope, the scale, and some of the key features we see in human trafficking and slavery issues in Southeast Asia. This is a rough approximation of the process I intend to follow for the next 20 minutes or so. Stats and trends, some of the key issues that arise from those or that are suggested from those stats and trends, and then a little bit, maybe saying strategies is quite generous, but some of the key features, I think, of maybe even challenges related to response in this region that I think are also applicable more broadly, and will certainly come up in the course of our discussions in the next couple of days. Because this is a scene setting, I feel obliged to begin by just looking at some of the broad forms of exploitation that we have in Southeast Asia and the world at large. I'm going to steal a little bit from my colleagues at ILO because they do have the most recent global statistics. And I'm sure I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, but these are not maybe unfamiliar to many of us already. There are an estimated 21 million people trafficking in persons in forced labor in the world. This region, Asia Pacific, is particularly vulnerable to this challenge. We can see that forced labor in particular is a major form of exploitation, accounting for approximately 56% of the world's total. 11.7 million people are believed to be victims of forced labor in Asia Pacific. I work for a migration organization, and so it's one of the features of this that is particularly interesting for me is that 44% of people in forced labor are thought to be migrants. That's an incredibly high statistic, but I think highlights very much the vulnerability of migrant populations, and one that I think is well understood in this region, but not necessarily everywhere. In the greater Mekong sub-region, I'm offering statistics, numbers drawn from a variety of sources here, approximately 13 million migrant workers. There have been studies shown, for example, at national level, to suggest that about 13% of migrant workers from Vietnam within the region may be trafficked, 17% of Thai fishermen may be trafficked. It's very, very difficult to get accurate estimates of a problem which is clandestine by nature. And I think we all struggle with that. Everyone up here on the panel would agree that the issue of data and accurate data remains a principal challenge to addressing this problem. And I will certainly come back to this at various points in the next few minutes. IOM, I'm benefiting a little bit from some of the work that my colleagues have done in the Greater Mekong sub-region in the last number of months. We've done a study with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It is actually the largest, it's a study involving the largest numbers of victims of trafficking ever done in a single study. There were 1,102 identified victims of trafficking that were interviewed over a period of 3 months. 42.2% were male, 57% were female, and I'm going to be presenting a bit on their experiences and what we know based on discussions with them. All of them were migrants, and the reasons for migration were varied, as we might expect. But the largest number, by far, 42.5%, said they were not earning enough money at home. They had expenses, and these range from having to support children, to aging parents, to other things. 37.9% also knew of others who had successfully migrated, or were believed to have successfully migrated, and were earning more money. So you put those two things together, and you have a powerful incentive to migrate for work. Not only do people need higher incomes, they see examples in their daily lives of people who have done it successfully. But of course, this doesn't always go well. And the people that were interviewed numerous occasions in the course of this study, had been working either in fishing, domestic workers, factories, and so on. You can see, I hope you can see the slide, the number of different sectors and types of work that people had found themselves in. Because we're talking about people who have been identified as victims of trafficking, the study found that the fishing sector and the domestic worker sector in particular had very, very long working hours per day. Fishing 18.8 hours per day, this was the norm, and domestic workers were working 15.2 hours per day. Those are extremely long and certainly exploitative working hours by anyone's estimates. The vast majority of people interviewed, 67%, had no days off. So this was 7 days a week. How long can you work 18.8 hours a day, 7 days a week before you collapse? The duration in which people were in the situation of exploitation also varied quite a bit. Again, the fishing sector tended to see some of the longest periods of time. Not surprisingly, people are at sea. Difficult to leave, right? Similarly with domestic workers. Private homes are not easy places from which to escape. Those who had been subjected to forced marriage were also particularly long in their situations of exploitation, at 12.5 years. So these were some of the longer periods that people found themselves in exploitation, 10, 11, and 12.5 years respectively. Migrant workers are moving because they want to earn a better income. It appears that many of them were never paid. 62.1% of the people interviewed, of that 1,102, never received pay. This was particularly high in agriculture, in the agricultural sector. And I know from this is not something that is specific to Southeast Asia. I know from other regions of the world where I've worked how easy it is when an undocumented migrant worker population is involved in agriculture. When the planting season is done or where the harvesting season is done, some of the farmers who are hiring them notify law enforcement of undocumented migrant workers in the vicinity, and they're also without payment. So this is a challenge not just here but in many places. In terms of the areas where people were the lowest paid, the fishing sector was averaging about $1.44 per day. Bearing in mind, of course, that they were working 18.8 hours per day on average. Domestic workers, even less, about 90 cents US per day. It's not just an issue of long working hours and non-payment. Victims of trafficking typically find themselves in what we call 3D employment: difficult, dangerous, and dirty. You can see from our statistics here, some of the injuries that were suffered. I think maybe one of the key features of this is simply, it's not just that injuries were suffered, but that a significant proportion never got any medical treatment. There were, of that 1,102, there were 7 people who in fact lost a body part, and none of those got any kind of medical attention for it. This was particularly prominent in the fishing sector. Of course, if you're at sea, medical treatment may be difficult to access. I want to look now at some of those sectors which we believe are particularly abusive, and the reasons why. And we'll maybe just start with the domestic work sector. I think many of you will probably be familiar with the case of Ariana, an Indonesian migrant domestic worker in Hong Kong. She was 23 years old, and I'm using this as somewhat representative and emblematic of the situation faced by many domestic workers around the world. She was accepted for employment by a private recruitment agency in 2012. Once she arrived in Hong Kong, the recruitment agency retained her passport and the contract that she had been issued. About a month later, she complained to the agency that she was experiencing abusive conditions in her place of employment. And the agency told her that she should stick it out, stay, work, and one of the reasons perhaps was because she had a debt to that agency of 15,000 Hong Kong dollars that she was supposed to be paying. So for the next 8 months, she remained in that place. She worked 21 hours a day, 7 days a week, not permitted a day off. She slept on the floor, wasn't permitted to go out or use the phone. She was beaten with a mop, a ruler, clothes hanger, for very minor sorts of infractions, such as which room she cleaned first, what order they were cleaned, and so on. When she could no longer work, and again, this was due to the physical injuries that she was suffering on account of the abuse, her employer bought her an air ticket, drove her to the airport, and left her there to take a flight home, left her with $70 Hong Kong dollars, and threatened her parents if she were to complain about her treatment. The Domestic Workers Association found her at the airport and made her case a very big deal. And her employer was eventually sentenced to prison on account of treatment. But to use this case as somewhat representative, why wasn't she able to leave? Well, if she wanted to keep her job, the policy of Hong Kong was that domestic workers have to be live-in. So she has to stay in the home of her employer who is abusing her. If she tried to go home, there would be shame in the eyes of family members, and she had debt that had to be paid. And then she would have to incur then more debt if she wanted to go back to Hong Kong to work. If she sought out a new employer while in Hong Kong, decided to stay quiet about the abuse, the rules, the local laws said she would have to leave her job and go home within 2 weeks and then reapply for a working visa. For people who are desperate for better incomes, all of this is going to cost time and money, which she doesn't feel she has. To report the abuse, again, remember that the reason the abuse came to light was because she was dumped at an airport and she was in a very bad physical condition, and somebody found her there and made her case an issue. If she wanted to report her case, basically she would not be able to work until the case had been resolved. And that presents yet another disincentive for people wanting to report. She needs special government permission, which is difficult. The domestic sector is particularly an issue in Asia, where 41% of all the world's domestic workers come. Indonesia and the Philippines in this region are particular large senders of domestic workers, 7.4 million from this country, and 1.9 million estimated from the Philippines. 2.4 million domestic workers, or foreign domestic workers, are believed to be in the GCC, the Gulf countries, and most of them would be from this part of the world. We also have within Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand would be the major destination points for domestic workers here. 12% are covered by minimum wage legislation in Southeast Asia. 3% are entitled to a day off. 1% have statutory limits on their normal maximum working hours every week. So there are policy challenges here, clearly. And just to say as an aside, this is also, these policy challenges are things we see everywhere in the world, where very often domestic workers are not covered by the protections afforded by labor law. We've heard a lot in the last 6 to 8 months about exploitation in the fishing sector, and that, of course, continues with news reports in the last week or so about quote-unquote slave ships in the waters of Papua New Guinea. The origins of this are said to be declining fish stocks, so fishing out in the Gulf of Thailand, increased the long-haul fishing, requiring fishermen to go very long distances and spend more time at sea than coastal fishing. Some authors have also pointed to 1989 and Typhoon Gay as being a particular seminal moment where the Thai fishing sector was particularly hard hit by that typhoon. 400 died, 600 missing and presumed dead, 200 fishing boats lost, and it really, local fishermen then tended to, or inclined to abandon the fishing sector because of what had happened. And this was another thing that then encouraged the setting up of informal brokerage networks throughout the Mekong region to attract fishermen from other countries. What we see, this informal system of brokers often makes job offers to people in remote villages for construction and agriculture, factory work that pay between 100 and 300 US dollars a month. There's a debt incurred to brokers for the travel, which is repaid after crossing the border. So once somebody's in a vulnerable situation, brokers are known then to sell on fishermen to the fishing boat captains for $300 to $800. There are some estimates which are more than that. And then maybe the particular thing that is, of real interest from a rights perspective is what has been called the sea prison environment. The work consists of bringing in nets, removing fish from nets, putting out nets, sorting and storing fish, and equipment repairs. This is 18 to 22 hours of work a day, 7 days a week. Many of the fishermen are holding false seafarers' booklets that transferred between boats at sea. There are reports of people being locked up, bodies thrown overboard when dead, and significant physical abuse, whipping with toxic stingray tails and so on, if complained or tried to arrest. The Associated Press did a very well-known investigation for more than a year into this and noted particularly the accrual of debt that wouldn't be paid for months and months. And this is something we see with many migrant worker populations, is that debts are accumulated for the migration process, which then have to be paid, which means you have a disincentive again to try to seek another context if you can. And I pulled this quote from that AP investigation report. There must be a mountain of bones under the sea. The bones of the people could be an island, it's that many. So, and this is again a data problem. We simply don't know how many people. I also thought, and I'm nearing the end of my time here, but I would be remiss if I didn't say something about the abuses that have been so widely reported in the Bay of Bengal. I raised this in part because it struck me as very interesting how immediately when some of the reports of people being stranded at sea, there was a rush to say, yes, this is trafficking, no, this is not trafficking, and there was an immediate debate about what we call this. And I guess one of the reasons for that is because it relates to rights and it relates to the protection of rights that has been created since the trafficking protocol, and many of the national law and regional instruments have been encouraging more and more protection for people identified as victims of trafficking. Of course, when you get very large numbers of people, protection is then expensive. And calling something this or that then implies cost and responsibilities. And it was, I think, part of that debate about whether this was trafficking or not trafficking was largely drawn out of that challenge. Whom do we protect? What are our obligations to protect? And again, much of this happened at sea, on the high seas, where law is a little bit, it's less clear than in other places. So in 2012, we had clashes, civil strife in Rakhine State, 140,000 people estimated to have been homeless. In 2014, and again, these are estimates and rough estimates at best, 62,000 people traveled irregularly by boat in 2014. The Bay of Bengal was the largest movement of people in the region since the Vietnam War. And in 2015, until May, there were 25,000 people who took that journey. And again, another statistic, this was from UNHCR, about 1.2% of them are believed to have died en route. Particularly concerning. Now, the reason I call this abuses rather than trafficking is because there was a lot of discussion about whether this was trafficking or not. Trafficking requires three elements: an action, a means, and a purpose specified in the protocol. There was a lot of question whether the purpose was in fact exploitation, which is left undefined in the trafficking protocol. Some of these definitional questions are very much at the root of why we have such a hard time with statistics and numbers, framing the problem as a challenge. In the month of May, we were looking at about 2,000 people who were stranded at sea in ships. Many of them have been abandoned. Many of these ships have been abandoned by their smugglers and were adrift. The abuses they experienced were fairly horrific. About 40% were thought to be malnourished, and 2 to 4% were severely malnourished. Human skeletons, really. They had been beaten with metal rods, engine chains when they were asked for food. Fights broke out on board over the scraps of food that remained. Women and girls have been subjected to sexual violence and forced marriage. There was a lot of ransoming happening. This is not the only place in the world we've seen this, but we see it also in Central America, Mexico, and the US, as well as in the Middle East, where migrants are trying to get from country A to country B, and in between, once they're out of their own country, smugglers are calling their families and torturing them on the phone if the families don't cough up significant amounts of money for their release. It's thought that about 920 people died at sea in the course of this operation. At the end of May, the boats had more or less stopped. It will be very interesting to see whether, in fact, this starts up again, because normally the sailing season starts in mid to late September and October. So it is normal for it to have stopped. Whether that's a result of the increased attention and policies that have been put in place since that time, or simply because it was the end of the sailing season, I think we're going to have to see. And then just finally, because we're going to get into a lot of this, I think, in the next little while, just to highlight some things that I think probably need some thinking about. First of all, identification of people remains a huge challenge. Despite the millions of people estimated to be in situations of forced labor and slavery and exploitation, U.S. State Department TIP report estimates that there are about 40 or 45,000 people identified as trafficked every year by everybody, which is a very small number. And we need to do much better than that. There are problems related to reintegration. I think it was raised earlier today. When foreign people are identified as having suffered abuse, the immediate response is send them home and let the country of origin deal with them. IOM research has shown that it's upwards of 60% of people who are returned without reintegration support are subjected to exploitation again in the year after that experience. Prevention: how do we use information to change behavior? It's not just enough to know. A lot of people know that bad things happen in the course of an irregular migration journey, but to change behavior is something else, and maybe we need to aim at that goal as opposed to simply knowledge and awareness raising. The fact is that most migrants are young people. Young people are invariably optimistic about their ability to escape some of this
It's not going to happen to me, despite the knowledge. And that's something we have to just accept. How do we change behavior with information? And where do we target those efforts? Prosecution and redress, criminalize exploitative conduct. We have a lot of gaps, I think, in law, because so many countries have now criminalized trafficking in persons, but we're not always agreeing on what that is, and what the difference between trafficking in persons is and the exploitation, which seems to be the consequence of trafficking in persons, or it's part of trafficking in persons. There are some legal issues there that need to be resolved as well. Can migrants who experience abuse seek civil remedies against abusive employers? In theory, yes. In practice, no. That might be something that we can focus a little bit more on. Balancing labor migration policies, and then finally, I think it was mentioned by Ambassador Ong this morning, sharing of information is critical. And in this region, we've got a long way to go, I think, before that becomes effective to the point of improving joint cooperation on this. So I'll leave it at that. I'm over time. Thank you for your indulgence.